Thank you, Carrie. Thank you. It's been a while since I've done one of these things. So welcome to another Community Builders Learning Call. I am super excited by the number of people that we have on today, because it's always a bit worrying when you do something like this, and because of the nature of the internet, particularly when you have like free webinars like this, you're never sure how many people are going to turn up, and so it might be a conversation of just myself, Carrie, and another person, or you could be overwhelmed with the so many questions and people. But it's good to have everyone here. Now, the purpose of this call is really to share the knowledge of the group, to see how we can work out how to do this community building thing, whether that's online or offline, and to focus the conversations. What has been great to have is for Carrie, Melissa Jones, to join us. Now, she's had, 10, 15 years of experience in the community building space. She's now a community consultant, she's a community leader, she's also an entrepreneur, and she's writing a book. Are you at the end of writing a book now?
I'm co-writing it, yeah. The draft is done. So it's not anywhere near being finished, but yes, the book is in progress.
On the thick of it, and that's with Charles Vogel, is that correct?
Yep. Correct.
So for those of you, Charles was also on a previous, for those of you on that call, there was Charles Vogel, who was author of Art of Community, and he was on a call previously. So yes, there's a lot of knowledge and experience, I'm sure, that Carrie can share with us. And I think to spark that off, it'd be nice to have some questions to work with. But I think to kick it off, let's get to know a bit more about Carrie. And be nice maybe to share a bit about your journey to becoming a community builder. And then in the meantime, I'm going to scroll through these questions and see what we can start off with. So over to you, Carrie.
Awesome. Yay. I'm so excited to be here. It's been a while since I've been on a webinar myself, so I'm excited to see all these people from all around the world. So yeah, a little bit about my background. As was mentioned, I've been building community kind of as a hobby for 15 years. Since I was fairly young, I discovered online communities. I was a pretty awkward teenager and needed somewhere to go to feel like I could be accepted and could find friends that I really had deep connections with. And where I found that was through online communities. So I became a super moderator of a community when I was pretty young, and went on to study that in college, in my undergrad, and kind of ended up by accident working for tech startups, and those tech startups were building, they were calling them networks of people at the time, to basically answer questions for a large subset of users. They would have like an expert community that could go in and volunteer and help other users. So what I realized pretty early on was, if we continue to build one-to-one connections between these experts and the brand, that this will never be able to grow, and also that these experts have so much to teach one another. So actually what we need to do is create a community. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, I'm hearkening back to my early days on the internet. And really, like, my career has kind of grown from there. So in 2014, I joined CMX, which you might be familiar with David Spinks. And we really grew that company from being a conference into being a hub of research and training, and all kinds of resources for community managers all over the world. And over the last 2 years, I've been consulting. So I was kind of itching to get my hands back into building online communities for brands. So over the last 2 years, I've been really lucky to be able to work with the American Medical Association. I worked with one of the US candidates for the presidential election in 2020. I've worked with Buffer, with Patreon leaders from those communities. So it's been kind of a wild ride. And actually right now, today is the first day of school and I am going back to school. So I'm getting my master's degree and studying online communities and how they impact our offline experience of community, really. So we'll see how that goes. It's a 2-year program. I'm teaching and I'm also taking courses and doing research. So that starts today. Today's a big day for me. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much for sharing that. So I felt like there's your own experience of needing connection, and then how you use that to apply that professionally. So I think to kick off with, also I just want to say it's great to see you going back to, like we were talking previously before everyone joined the call about going back to academia, to be able to take a step back and get an overview of how this whole community thing's actually working for us, because it feels like the world is getting so fast and everyone's like thinking, particularly with online communities, everyone's trying to build an online community. What does that really mean, and how does that really work, and what does it mean for us as people in communities? So we might dig into that kind of conversation later. I think another topic that came up also in the conversations was around how community and business mix. So I'd be very curious to find out more about your perspective on that, and also get the perspectives of people on the call. For those of you who might have like a thought or something to offer, I hope that you realize there's a way to put your hand up. I'm trying to see. For those of you familiar with Zoom, there should be a way to actually put your hand up, and I'll be able to spot you and then maybe bring you into the call to share that question or that thought live. If not, for those of you with video, just physically put your hand up if you can't find the button. So let's kick off. I think a couple of people on the call, and I know from my community at the Happy Startup School, there is this need to actually build community and to kickstart that process. I saw a post, I think it's quite an old post of yours on Medium, actually I was looking at it today, around the idea of how to just get going with the idea of community. And so what I'd be interested in your thoughts of this balance of planning and designing, the kind of community, being intentional about it, but also not getting sucked into that and just doing something and making something happen. So maybe telling a story about your experience of kicking off a community for the first time.
Yeah, so I think you were reading the post about launching the founding members community for CMX. Yeah, I saw you highlighted it in Medium. I got an email. I was like, oh, that's a throwback. I think maybe 3 years old or so. And this actually, I think, pairs nicely with Spencer's question around what would you consider the essential elements that a community should consist of? Particular because, Spencer, you asked about the early days. So that I'll talk a little bit about that CMX founding members community, but it's unique because, and maybe not unique to your experience, but unique because that community already existed. We had already built lots of relationships. We had built a prior open community space, and it was really about like, okay, how do we create a smaller community and a really specific offering for a smaller community within the larger community manager community. It was like a even deeper community inside of that. So that's a little different than building something completely from scratch. If you have a startup idea, and so for instance, I was launching a business for making dog shirts for a hot minute. And that's something I have no connections in. I have no relationships in. Building a community in that realm would be very difficult. And so do you see, like, they're two different things. One is you have to start with the individual relationships, and the other is the relationships are already there. Now you need to cement them into a shared space with shared values. You need to figure out what the boundaries are, things like that. So I'm assuming that all of you have been working on whatever you're working on for a little bit and have some existing relationships. So that is where everything begins. One of the things that Charles and I are writing about actually in the book that we're working on is how large communities always grow from small communities. It never starts the other way around, where there's like this giant group, and then all of a sudden, like all the connections are solidified. So there's always pairs of relationships that then get solidified into groups that then can grow over time. So what are the essential elements of a community? I think in the early days, one of the most important and often overlooked elements of building a community is leadership, and how important that is. It's essential that you lead in a way that feels open. So it's not like top down. So you're saying like, oh, here's how things are going to be. Here's our values. Here are the 3 things we're going to do. You know, it has to be co-created. So that's sort of this thing that I think a lot of us are figuring out. What does community leadership really look like right now, especially online? It's a completely different model for leading. It's totally different than, like I said, like the top down. It's more about bringing people together, asking, you know, what questions do you have about what I'm building? How can I create something more effective for you? How can we create something fun and exciting together, as opposed to me, the business owner or the community leader, just delivering an experience to you? Those are very different things. The other thing is, it depends if you're building an online or an offline community, but the space is essential. Setting that space up and getting like a minimum viable, whatever it might be, for your community is key. For us in the CMX founding members group, we had to do a little bit of technology research and figure out of the now 60 plus community platforms on the market, which was going to meet our needs, and then set that up and make it feel kind of warm in a digital way. And then if it's an offline group, how are you going to gather them? When are you going to gather them? How often? Figuring out things like that. I could go on and on about this. So I don't, to stop me if I'm saying things that are either helpful or not.
Well, if there are any questions, please, if you sparked any thoughts, please put your hand up, or if you're not able to do that, or you just unmute yourself and quickly butt in, and I'll try and bring you into the conversation. What I'm quite interested in is whether you had any. So you have the story of how the CMX community started, and it sounded like it started from already, but there's a group of people, there's an existing community as such, and you were trying to create a kind of inner circle in the sense of the founding members group. So have you any stories, or have you worked with anyone who's tried to create that first minimum viable community, that little group, and what did they do, particularly if it was like, let's start with an online community? How did they start creating those initial connections and bringing people in to then give people, you know, some idea of how they might start themselves?
Yeah. So the example that came to mind when you were talking about that is actually a woman that I know started a community back in Seattle, where I used to live. It was an adult summer camp that she really wanted to launch. She had been talking about it for years and was kind of putting it off, like, this is not a sustainable business and I have to stay in my tech job. So what she did was, in her off hours from her full-time job, she just started putting together these Facebook events saying, like, come to my home, join me in creating, they would do like crafting events, and she'd get like 5 people to come meet her and do like intuitive collaging events and tarot card reading events and things like that, until she had enough people on the list, which I don't know what enough meant for her to actually launch the summer camp. But she ended up leaving her full-time job and launching the summer camp because she had done enough of these small events and built enough of these small individual relationships that it was safe enough for her to take that risk and say, okay, I know my people are going to show up at this summer camp with me because I've been putting in the work and doing all of these more intimate events up until now. So that's really the key is building, again, going back to the relationships, which we all know are so important, building and cementing those and making sure that you're not just launching something to people you don't know, right? So yeah. So
it's very much around creating those deep connections at the beginning, which I think to a lot of businesses, startups, and budding community builders feels very slow, and also particularly I know from entrepreneurs, they're an impatient bunch, and they don't think it's actually successful because it's not growing exponentially and quickly. Yeah. I hear I've heard from many people who I've talked about communities and startups, you know, they start immediately getting the idea, right, what Facebook campaign can we create, and how can we create a funnel to drive people into this thing that they can then capture their email lists and then build their community from that.
Yep.
And that for me sounds like a lot of time and effort that's going to go into a black hole because of that lack of really deep connection from the beginning. Is that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And every step of the way, I find that entrepreneurs that I've worked with are tempted by those, like, how do we create the funnel and how do we create the landing page and let's create a list. There's a constant temptation to create something transactional, especially if you're working in a for-profit context. This is not necessarily true for social movements or political campaigns, because the idea of like this hustle mentality, the idea of the exponential growth hockey stick curve is so deeply entrenched in so much of our entrepreneurship culture that it's nearly impossible to escape from it. So that will constantly be in your face, and you have to take it with a grain of salt and remember that those relationships are actually what are going to get you through, not the lists of people that you build. That's who you're going to end up going to when you're in a really tough place. That's who is really going to show up for you, not somebody that you've emailed 5 times and they've opened your email 3 times, you know, looking at the stats and trying to figure out exactly how to get people to open your email. Like, that's all important. I'm not saying that it's not important, but it's not going to help deepen relationships and build community that you'll really need when things get rough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the what I can relate to with your story around the woman doing the adult summer camp, ironically, it's a similar path to what we took with the Happy Startup School, and we have an event called the Summer Camp, which is on in about a couple of weeks. We started off by doing small events, lots and lots of small events, talking to people. It got to a point where actually they wanted a bit more, and then we did our summer camp, and we did the big event, and we did that for a couple of years, and then there was this, all right, how do we stay in contact in between these big events?
Mm-hmm.
And that was the journey of actually for us building the online community, was actually very much from an offline perspective. I'm conscious that's a very specific way of doing that, and that was unique to the kind of, because of the journey. It wasn't particularly intentional, it's just the journey that we took. So it feels like having that physical face-to-face it makes it easier to create those deep connections at the beginning. Are there examples of being able to do that without having the offline aspect?
Oh yeah,
ability?
Absolutely. I agree that, and this is like pretty much any psychology class will tell you that, like, face-to-face, you're going to bond quicker because you have different cues and you have more nonverbal communication that's going to help you build relationships more quickly. But as I mentioned, when I was younger, I joined an online community where I didn't know anyone. I never met any of those people face-to-face, but we still had deep connections. We'd call each other on the phone. We would do live chats and things like that. And many of these really large communities, like I'm thinking right now of Sephora's brand beauty insiders community, most of these people don't meet face-to-face. They cement their connections online. And so, I mean, how you do that is you have to know that not everyone is going to have these deep connections, but build for, in Sephora's case, they had this saying because they found out that one of their members in their online forum was contributing 30% of the content on their online platform, 30% from one person. And they would just say, like, what would Veronica do? That was the name of the person who was contributing all that. And so they were building for Veronica at all times. Like, how do we find more Veronicas and give them what they want? It obviously makes her feel very special, and she feels like an insider. She's getting exclusive access. So let's do more of that. And that's sort of like building with that person in mind and knowing that not everyone is going to, at this large scale online, have those deep connections.
Yeah. So there's a aspect, I think this relates to Spencer's question. He just said, in creating deep connections in the beginning, would you say it is worth considering, or even best, to open to a super niche? So when I heard you talk about Veronica as being very, very clear about who you want to help and who you're talking to, in order for that, for people to understand how they can connect to the conversations that you're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting that super niche in terms of having a really niche set of shared values or a really niche identity among people is, that's kind of make or break. If you can't get down to that niche identity, it can be really, really hard to build a community. So I'm thinking right now, actually, one of my clients tried to build a community. They're a consulting organization that works with sales professionals. They do like sales enablement and things that I had never heard of until I started working with them. And they had built a community that was for learning, teaching and learning professionals and sales professionals and sales enablement professionals and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And nobody cared about what they had launched because everyone was like, I don't know if this is for me. Am I in this community? It was just far too broad. And when we actually kind of took it down to a more niche perspective, we started building just for sales enablement professionals. People did start to talk because they felt safer. Like there was this inside language that they knew among sales professionals that people in learning, teaching and learning just did not. They didn't speak the same language. You know, that community for a variety of reasons ended up closing. But I will say that after 2 years of investing in it, they made like 6 figures in terms of their sales return on investment from it, just from getting building relationships inside of that space. So even when the community closed, and I'm not even going to say that it failed, when the community closed, they learned and they built relationships that fueled business success. So it doesn't have those, this idea of like the community has to last forever is not necessarily true. If it's not serving people at the community level, it doesn't have to last forever. No, you know.
There's a number of things that spring up for me there.
Yeah.
Firstly, around, and I'm referring to the community canvas that Fabienne and Sasha developed. And the aspect of that is about defining what success means for the individual member and what it means to the community. So it feels like at that early stage, being very, very clear about what that means so that it makes it easier for people to engage and to know whether they should be in or out of this thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And a community should also help people grow into who they want to become by, you know, cementing relationships that will make them more of who they would like to be. And if you can't figure out who the people in your community would like to become, you're going to have a really hard time creating experiences for them that resonate and they want to show up for.
And then the other aspect around how long the community should last is there's the people who run the community, and there's, well, you know, the core, the active founders of the community, and then there's people who are the members. And it feels like if the needs of the members aren't being met, then you won't have a community. But also if the need of the founders, in this case it might be a business, but also could be just the people who started the community and they were on a journey, if they're not being met anymore, then who holds that space? Either it needs to be passed on, or that community it doesn't necessarily have to live anymore because there's no need at that end. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah. So it's sort of, this is how we would talk about CMX in the early days too, is if CMX were to no longer exist, it's not like a community of community managers wouldn't exist. And there are several other organizations like the Community Roundtable, and this is another like community builders community. It's not like those relationships that had been built would dissolve, if that makes sense. And someone probably would step in to lead that and fill the space that was left. But say like the entire profession of community management were to go away and all these people didn't need the resources anymore, then maybe it doesn't need to exist anymore. Now, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But the community needs to serve a purpose for its members. It doesn't need to just exist to exist.
I feel there's the service of the members who join and maybe leave, but then there's also how it serves the people who are maintaining it and running it and keeping it going. And I relate that to whether it's community building or running a business. If you're doing something, you're not getting anything from it, and whether that's energy or financially rewarded, you will burn out at some point, and it will go away. So unless someone steps in and gets their needs satisfied as well through building this community, it'll be a challenge. So I'm interested in that whole success of the member, success of the community, but also success of the founders or the leaders of that community, because you said leadership was very important when you were the community.
Yeah, and even if you are successful too, you might still burn out. Like that's the really, I mean, burnout is in every profession. We happen to talk about it a lot in like entrepreneur spaces, but it's a problem for everyone. So I think one of the things that I've been thinking about, and I don't really have solid thoughts on it yet, so this is me sharing something that I'm still mulling on, is the difference between self-care in these times and taking care of yourself and making sure that your community serves your needs and what your goals are, but also community care. So how can your community actually help you and be, but not be such a, like, you have to take care of yourself. You have to have strong boundaries. Like, don't let yourself check your email on the weekends and things like that. Instead, say like, okay, well, what do I need? And how can I ask for help from my community in this? And how can I create a community where people can let me know if they see that I'm burning out and say, I'm going to step in and help you with this. I see that you're having a really tough time right now. I don't know how that might work in a context of like when I'm working with a Fortune 50 company. I don't know that it will work. I don't know if that language will resonate. But it tends to resonate like with small businesses that I work with and things like that, like that your community is actually there with you in this and can help support you if you're having if you're feeling like you need a break, that you can be transparent with them, and that you're not just building something that is like you providing for them. But
I'm very much, I believe that's very important, whether that you are within a profit-making company or whether you are building much more of a social community. It will only be sustainable if it sustains you, whether that's energetically or financially. And so if you're not able to have that sense of to be able to create that sense of self-care, feel supported by the community, then that's going to be a challenge. Lana, I'm sure, has lots to say about this, and I'm going to bring her on now. Lana, please unmute yourself and give us some knowledge bombs.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Carrie, for bringing it up. That idea of we need to also create space for us as founders to be cared for or supported by the community. This is an ongoing discussion that I've been having, not just with Carlos, but also with other community builders, especially those who are founders. And one of the consensus that we had is also the importance of creating inner circles, of in essence, not just within the community, but also making it a collaborative community so that you can get support and you can, tag team with other people in terms of managing the community or getting engagement. And that in itself also prevents burnout on a founder scale. So I know that Carlos has immediately reached out to his inner circle and has created that. So I do hope this is also some practice for people to look into as to how we can create that support by creating inner circles within our community.
Yeah, I love that. That's a concept that Charles writes about, this idea of inner rings.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that doesn't necessarily have to be in the community that you're building for your startup, but having something like this where you're gathered right now is a form of getting community support and is its own kind of inner ring. So yeah, that's interesting.
Awesome. I remember Lana took me through this idea of circles of relationship, and I can remember talking to my co-founder about it, and he immediately thought about Meet the Fockers. And that's so you're going to be in circles of trust. But
I haven't thought about that movie in a while.
Watch it again.
Yeah.
So talking about this idea of self-care, this idea of actually being able to essentially, I would say, share the responsibility of the community with the members. I linking to some of the questions that have come through is the idea of creating engagement, creating a sense of a need to contribute, and how you allow people, give people permission to do that. And there's a fair different nuances to that question. But to begin with, it'd be interesting to hear from your experience, particularly online. How do you create that sense of, or give people a clear idea that they can contribute and they can step in? What does that mean? Is that an explicit thing that you approach people individually, or can you design that within how the community behaves, whether it's the rules of the community or the values? I'd be curious to hear any thoughts you might have on that from your experience.
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. There's the relational element of it, and then there's the design element of it. So the relational element, this goes back to what I was talking about cementing those relationships before launching the community is really key, because in an online community specifically, I will always find like 5 to 10 people who I know I can email privately to say, please contribute to this post. No one's writing, no one's responding to this, or like, please show up to this event. I don't know who's going to be there. I need you there. And so, yes, calling on those relationships. And someone had asked about founding like a founder community, not for founders, but for like your original members who are really invested. Yes, like this is exactly what that group would be, is the group that you know you can call on for help at any time. So that's how you get people to contribute, is by modeling that behavior and knowing that you have people that you can call on. So in an offline sense too, I've heard people, refer to this as like, you're my ringer, like the person that you can call on, even if no one else is raising their hand to contribute. You can be like, Beth, I know, like we talked privately, like, yeah, I know you have a question, to get the ball rolling. And then, so that's the relational side. And then the design side, this is a whole discipline unto itself. But yes, like making it really clear how members contribute. Also, the first several days of being in an online community specifically is what I'm talking about right now. It's crucial that people have a way to passively consume content that helps them understand, what is this community about? Who's here? Is this for me? If I do want to actively contribute, how do I do that? So designing some kind of a welcoming experience, whether that's like an email series or getting on the phone with you or someone on your team within the first like 30 days that they join, or getting a text or something like that. And then making it like your call to action buttons really clear, very user friendly, and making those calls to action about, like, again, actively contributing and not just necessarily consuming. Yeah.
No, the whole onboarding aspect of things and getting people to feel, to gently introduce them to the community, I think that's something that I've been learning a lot about. With our community, I've realized and heard from various members that they felt overwhelmed by the amount of content and stuff going on. And from a community builder point of view, content and conversations feels like value. More of it. You need to create lots and lots and lots of it. But then from a new person's point of view, it's like, whoa, where do I start? What do I do? And also feeling like everyone already knows each other.
Yes, that's it. That's the worst part.
Being last to a party.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. So it feels like on one level you're talking about how do you guide people with where they don't feel pressured to necessarily contribute straight away, they can passively consume and then understand whether this is for them and where they can then start speaking. Is there anything also about bringing people in cohorts?
Yeah, I was going to mention that too.
Yeah, what's your experience around that, and how that people can think about how they bring people into their community in a way that's a bit more, doesn't feel so vulnerable?
Yeah, so there's really like two kinds of communities. There's like the always welcoming, always open kind of community where anyone can join at any time. And then there's a cohort-based community, and you can have cohorts even within a larger community. So I was thinking about this in relation to like leadership programs within communities that I've launched. So on that presidential campaign, people can join the online community at any time, but if they want to become a part of a cohort within, there's a leadership program built in within that larger community, they have to apply to join. They're only brought in cohorts of about 30 people, up to 30 people. That cohort goes through training together. They go through a welcoming process. So they get on a Zoom call, introduce each other, introduce themselves to one another. And they go through an experience together, as opposed to like as an individual, you know that you're going to have a group of people you can turn to if you're stuck. But then there's also, when you get added to the cohort, there are people who have been in the community for a while that are already there, who are there to greet you and welcome you. And in fact, the future cohorts are led by past leaders. And that's how that program actually scales, is the headquarters doesn't have to train all of these cohorts of leaders. They actually train the trainers to bring on these new cohorts and then pass on the baton, essentially. Excellent. Now that's easy to do in a high stakes presidential election. People, like, their commitment is very high because there's a strong shared purpose, and that's not, frankly, always the case in every community.
But it sounds like what I got from that was this idea of a shared experience and a journey that you go on together.
Yeah.
So by being able to define that journey, for instance, with us at the Happy Startup School, we have a course that we try and get people to do together, and it's about, you know, building purpose and profit, and how you have these you get into a space where you have conversations that start connecting people, and that shared experience then creates hopefully a sense of, actually, it's not me and 100 people or 1,000 people, it's just me and these 20, 30 people, and we can actually get to know each other a bit better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which, I mean, frankly, can be a lot more work for the builder, because you have to craft that experience for the cohort, as opposed to just letting them go in and then automating everything. I will say at CMX, when we launched, this is specifically around like learning communities, which is its own subset of community building, but we launched an online training. And when we did the cohort-based training, so we let in up to 50 people join at the same time, going through the same 6-week experience, the completion rate was like 90%. Which for online learning, by the way, is extremely high.
Amazing.
Yeah, but we would do like online events together. I mean, it was a lot of time and energy. And then we said, okay, we can't sustain this because we need to keep building up other things. That was a business decision that we made. Whether it's right or wrong is, who knows. And so we turned it into this automated, always on, anyone can do the training anytime, and the completion rate dropped. I don't even know what it was when I ended up exiting, but it was definitely not 90%. So one of the other interesting things that happened with that is that we would give free training to certain groups, or people would get like heavy discounts, and the people who paid full price had a completion rate of 100%, and the people who got discounts or like got free training, they almost had a 0% completion rate. So that money, it was actually a commitment device to get people to like sign up and really go through it, and, you know, make that commitment to themselves, because you don't have a cohort to commit to.
Yeah.
In that case. Yeah.
No, there is something around, we've had that experience of when you have accountability created by being in a group of people who are basically pushing you along, and also accountability based on, I paid money for this, I should need to do something about it. Also, I think with the money aspect, there's more of an intention sometimes created. Of course, depends how much you sell a course for access to your community, but we found the higher the price, the more likely someone's going to commit to completing a course, because there's a very strong intention that they want to do something here.
Yeah.
An interesting, when you were talking there around going from a managed cohort to then trying to automate it. So one of the experiences we've had is when that, you know, you've done a few cohorts, what happens to those people afterwards? So then you need to, particularly if you've got a small team, you're going to have to start thinking about the next journey that you're going to be taking people on. So then it starts becoming, and this is why, from a personal perspective, I'm not sure, Carrie, this is what you're also alluding to, then there's energy management. You know, you're going to be doing all these entry-level cohorts, and then the next level of cohorts, et cetera, et cetera. that's where I think some of these questions around automation and this balance of how do you get people in feeling connected, but at the same time, how do you manage the growing community of people you already have there in the first place, or that you have now building up?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's no like magic bullet solution to that. It's partially why we never launched an advanced course with CMX, is because energy management, like we can only really support this group. And we ended up bringing on a group of people who had graduated from the course to become teaching assistants in future courses. That did not work out. So to be transparent, I think people really wanted to do it, but it's just in their day-to-day work, it wasn't a model that made sense for people who are in professions where they're always on. You know, they don't want to have another thing to commit to where they're not paid for it. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways you can leverage the folks who have been through different cohorts to take on some of the work of building that community with you, but the incentives have to be aligned and the structure has to be relevant to your particular member base.
Yeah, I think there's very much just maybe something that a lot of people might shy away from. There's energy and commitment, and also there's monetary reward at some level, and how you can be very, very clear about what that means for people. Because if you are being part of a community, what does that mean in terms of, you know, you commit time to that community? What are you getting back as a contributor? And maybe that's purely there's a need to just contribute, and that's good enough. I think when it becomes, and this is where maybe we take the conversation, when you start thinking about the financial viability of a community and what it takes to support it, and you see that community growing, and then you see people within that community who are contributing, then questions I feel or conversations can need clarifying so that people can understand their expectations. I.e., oh wow, you got this amazing community of 1,000 people, you must be making loads of money, and I'm contributing and I'm not actually getting anything out of it. What does that mean? I think some very adult conversations that need to be had, and a level of transparency needs to be had. I don't know if you had an experience of communities like that, where conversations started to go down that route.
I mean, sure, it happens all the time that people who participate in communities for-profit organizations ask for jobs. And in fact, it's actually a great recruiting mechanism to find people that are active in your community and really care about what you're building. Maybe you do want to hire them to do work with you, full-time, part-time, contract, whatever it might be. I'm actually in the process of figuring this out with one of the people that I'm coaching right now. Is there's a group of leaders within the community, and she's considering bringing on a handful of them for paid work. So how do you communicate that to those who are not getting the paid opportunities? And how do you make sure that those who are not getting those do not completely lose their motivation? Because really what's happening in that particular case is you're mixing external rewards, in this case money, with the internal reward of contributing, helping people. And when you start mixing in incentives, mixing in rewards like this, things get really confusing. It's just each situation has to be dealt with, I think, case by case. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I caution people not to do is essentially like what BuzzFeed did, which is build a huge, amazing community of contributing writers and then fire staff that are paid because the ones that are volunteering are so much more productive. Yeah, don't do that. That's terrible. But it happens, and
that just sounds like profiteering. And
yeah, it's why BuzzFeed there's a bunch of union conversations going on right now, and yeah.
No. Okay. No, I'm glad you raised the idea of or just made people aware of how it can be confusing when you have the extrinsic and intrinsic motivations and rewards. And I like the way you phrase that, because it gives an easy model to think about. Okay, what is driving this person? Why are they wanting to contribute? And I think Charles also mentioned this in one of the previous calls. Is like, or maybe it was in his book. Is like if you then try to reward someone with an extrinsic reward when they were actually really intrinsically motivated, that could actually damage the relationship.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel good to be on the receiving end of that either.
No. And so kind of pulling on that thread of money, one of the questions I think that came up was the idea of, I think it was Mel, she runs a community and she's especially interested in how community and business does and doesn't mix. So I think Mel might have left us. Yes, unfortunately she's gone. But I don't know if you had any thought, maybe we've touched on it already, but I don't know if you had any other thoughts about the idea of building businesses and building communities and money and purpose and how those things mix. Do you ever have any experience of having challenges around that? Or?
I mean, certainly I see this often doesn't happen with like founders who are building communities, but I will say that in really large organizations, there seems to be a huge rift between community and business, essentially, like what the business outcomes need to be, which is essentially in a for-profit business in the US at least, like value creation or revenue. And so at the end of the day, that's the most important thing in most large, and I don't know, let's just go ahead and say like any large organization, that is the most important thing. The profit has to be there. And so when you get a community that you're building, so I'm thinking, for example, of one of a telecoms company in the US, they have built this community and a community program of people who help each other with their technical questions, with their internet and things like that. I don't know who wants to do that, but somebody does. And over the years, it's been going on for about 10 years. Every year, they have to show that the community is driving more value for the organization than it's taking away. And so what that really means is that resources are being stripped away from the community every year. They're getting budget taken away. They have to do things in a more automated fashion. They can't hire more people. The technology that they have, they can't continue building on it. And so that's really, really frustrating. And like the incentives just aren't aligned there from an organizational perspective. And so those community builders tend to burn out much faster because they're constantly being asked to prove their value. I don't see that happening though a lot in startups and in organizations that are deeply mission and values driven. And that's because communities help us cement our values, put our values into practice, drive our mission forward. And we're not, as founders, always thinking about like, obviously the revenue has to be there, but we also want to create a change in the world. Otherwise we wouldn't be driven to do this and get out of bed every morning. So it just makes more sense. That's why I think a great example of this is like Airbnb, very mission-driven organization. They've always invested in their community since day one. Their CEO's title is also head of community. So it does not have to be at odds, but in a lot of these like public companies, value creation and shareholder value is still just the most important thing. Now I see that changing somewhat. There was a coalition of CEOs last week that made an announcement that they weren't going to prioritize shareholder value above everything else, which is actually that's pretty huge. But it's this is a multi-decade long journey, I think, that we're on right now.
Awesome. I want to bring on Mel. Do you know, unmute yourself, Mel, to see if there's, you wanted to elaborate more on your question.
Hello.
Experience. And you have baby along with you. That's good.
Yes, he's eating.
Cool.
Hi, Sebastian. There he is.
Oh my goodness.
Hey.
Oh.
What do you think about business and community?
He thinks, oh, he's waving there, huh? You think, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I started my business, my community because of my kids, because I run a parent community. And it's been really interesting because I've been doing the mom thing, it's been a long time to build those relationships. Has worked well because I haven't focused on any of the finance of it and just got my energy because it's the community that I need as well. But now it's turning into business mode and trying to figure out how to make an income from that while still meeting the needs of the community, wanting that community vibe, keeping relationship at the forefront. And yeah, just kind of any thoughts or ideas or things that have worked for people, that kind of side of things is where I'm at the moment. I've kind of tried to start it. We're doing an optional membership program. It's what we've attempted at the moment, so people can join for free, but then if they get great value from it, they can contribute voluntarily, and then we have a variety of levels from there that they can join and get more from. And it's a slow burner, and I'm hoping it will still work, but so I guess like other things people have done, or just how to keep that real vibe. I don't want them to feel like they're getting sold to all the time, and so I find it tricky, so maybe others do too.
Brilliant. No, I love that question, Mel. Carrie, have you had any thoughts or experience in what it sounds like going from a free thing to then, okay, to make this sustainable and I need to create revenue, but how does that affect existing members and new members?
Yeah, I mean, we had that huge question at CMX. We had a free open community for, I can't remember how many years, 3 years. And it's still open and free for people. And then we decided that in order to continue to run the business, we needed to create a membership model there. So we did create that was the founding member program I was talking about, the cohort, or the in a ring essentially within the larger community. We launched it alongside 50 of our members. And in fact, we just put up a landing page and said, would you be willing to pay for this? And 50 people signed up. And so we closed it off and said, okay, we're validated. Let's build this thing now. And then we launched that and built training alongside it and things like that. I can't speak to what CMX is doing right now. I'm a little out of the loop on it, but that's sort of how we thought about it. But I'm curious if anyone else has experience as well. I know this group has a lot of experience in addition to mine.
Thanks, Carrie. So on that, actually, I do recommend, I really like that Medium post, even though it's a couple of years old. I'll try and share the link in the comments if I can find it while talking.
Yeah, Fox had asked for the would you pay for this page? I believe there's a screenshot of it in that blog post. Yeah.
Yes, there is in that blog post, and if it does pop up on my history, I'll stick it up. There's so what I understood from that post, just to summarize, is there's within that community what we're trying to do, as well as essentially get people invested in the idea that they're supporting the core of the community, there is another element of value you're providing them, because they are trying to do something very specific and you want to help them achieve that goal. And so I think with you, Mel, it's having a guess to start off with as to what that might be, and then working with that initial group of people to then refine, actually, how can I really help them? And what is it that's going to be of value to them? So there's a combination of a guess and then validating those assumptions and maybe learning through that conversation. Did that capture that right, Carrie, or was that anything else?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was essential. I just posted the link here in the chat. So yeah, I mean, we created a guess. Like, we thought people would want some kind of designation as founding members, because the CMX brand had been around for several years and had, developed some notoriety. So we thought that might give them like a leg up when they're looking for jobs, or even, as a way to say, like, within their current job that they're doing professional development. So it was that, plus exclusive resources, plus I think it was special events is what we launched with. But essentially what I started doing when I was launching this was overthinking everything. I started putting together this whole PowerPoint of, here's what we'll build, and this will be launched over 30 days. And then I talked with another founder friend, and he was like, launch it tomorrow, stop doing this. And I was like, tomorrow, are you crazy? And that's when I just built the landing page of here's the things that we think you want. It's $99. Will you pay for this? And people took out their credit cards and paid for it. And I stopped overthinking. And then I could build from there, as opposed to engineering this giant, paying for software and engineering the whole community without getting feedback, and then waiting to put people in it, and, wasting a lot of time and money that way.
That's awesome. I think even just as an exercise of practicing a bit of vulnerability and putting something out there, that whole process, even as a step-by-step thing, is great, because it's just trying to, that process of thinking about what is it I need to tell these people that's going to make them interested and find value is a great way of just putting the message out there.
Yeah. I mean, it helps that, I'm sure that, Mel, you've been doing this for several years, that you've invested so much in them already that they probably want to give back in some way.
Cool. Excellent. Well, I'm conscious now that we are out of time. If anyone if they want to find out more about what you're doing, Carrie, maybe also follow what's happening with the book, do you want to leave them with any links or thoughts or ideas?
Sure. Yeah, you can find my website. It's gathercommunityconsulting.com. I have a newsletter that I write about every 2 weeks. That's more about research and personal experience, less about links and things like that. So if you're interested in kind of having a partner in some of the craziness that is building companies and building communities, that's what that newsletter is there for, is to give you some reassurance that you're on the right path. So yeah, that's
cool. And remind me, it's
gathercommunityconsulting.com.
Gathercommunityconsulting.com. Great. Well, again, thank you very much for your time, knowledge, experience, and advice. Thank you, all of you guys, for joining us and making this feel like something that's needed, something that's wanted. My need for contribution and feeling appreciated is very well met at the moment. I feel very happy to see you all here. I hope to see you on a future call. And please, as a favor to myself and Lana and the other people in the Community Builders group who basically help manage the group, please post messages on our Facebook group just to tell you about your experiences of the calls, how they've helped you, and also maybe anything else that you'd like to learn on the calls as well, so that give us some inspiration as to who to get on here. If you have thoughts and ideas of people that you'd like to bring on, and Carrie as well, you're included in that. You can think of someone you think should come to these calls and share their knowledge with this beautiful bunch of people. That'll be much appreciated. So yes, please share the love, create that sense of connection that we all need in this world. And until next time,
Carlos.
Goodbye. Oh yeah, sorry, Lana.
We have 2 events for September, online ones. So the other one is coming into our time. I'm hosting a masterclass on Start With Who. And then we also have the September 18, which is an online meetup, which we call the Story Swap. So for those who are here, it would be nice to also see you. You can find all the details in the events page in Community Builders.
Yes, of course. We have, it's exactly in, it's 2 hours time. We are going to be starting with who. So anyone who's like having those questions about where do I start, Lana is the lady. And yes, check out the Facebook group and the events page to find out more about what else is coming, the event on the 18th. So yes, thank you for reminding me, Lana. That's why I need someone else on this call. I get so excited I forget what to say. Again,
great call. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you very much.
Carlos.
High fives all around. Take care. Bye-bye.